welcome all of you to the webinar From Guidelines to Practice, a market-based approach to post-COVID-19 recovery in forced displacement settings. Can you help me, Elisa, with the next slide? Today, we have, as I said, a very exciting hour to come. First, we're going to hear from Ziad Ayubi, who's the head of Livelihoods and Economic Inclusion Unit in UNHCR HQ. Hello, Ziad. He's going to give us some opening remarks and contextualize the need for market-based response in post-COVID and COVID. And he's going to talk a little bit about the ILO-UNHCR partnership that we currently have, and we've been having for a while. Then I'm going to be talking a little bit about our approach to inclusive market systems. What is it that we are doing in different parts? And then we're going to listen from Robert Nyambaka and Nadia Nuts. Robert is a senior livelihood officer with UNHCR in Ethiopia, and Nadia is an AIMS technical officer in the ILO in Lebanon, and they are going to tell us how is it that we are applying market systems and AIMS into displacement settings, and how are they coping with 2020, basically. So without further ado, Ziad, welcome, and the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Fernando. Thank you so much. And thank you, everybody, for joining the webinar. I will take only a few minutes to set the scene, and then I will pass it to other panelists. First of all, let me stress and emphasize the importance of the issue of the right to work and self-reliance. As we speak, and before the COVID-19 hit, there was a situation of 70% of refugees living in places and locations where there is no right to work or limited right to work. And this is something that limit a lot the ability of people to integrate into local economies. 66% of refugees had limited freedom of movement before COVID-19. And 47% lived in countries with restricted access to financial services and bank accounts. So if we put these three figures as a starting point, we can imagine the situation of the refugees from a livelihoods angle in the world before COVID-19. Now, with COVID-19, we can add a layer of challenges that is making the life of these people even more difficult, and their ability to put food on their table is decreasing in a significant manner due to the lockdown and due to the health situation. The importance of the self-reliance and economic inclusion is very high when it comes to global processes around forced displacement. As we all know, the Global Compact on Refugees talked about self-reliance in its second objective. It's one of 4 objectives of the Global Compact dealing with self-reliance of refugees and host communities. When we talk about humanitarian development nexus, what else other than the livelihoods can really show the nexus in a very concrete manner, where the humanitarian assistance start fading out and the development interventions start kicking off, and this intersection is very important in the development work. So the relevance and the importance of the economic inclusion, the economic recovery, the livelihoods, the economic empowerment is higher than any time before. So I wanted to start with this message to go directly to the next message around the ILO-UNHCR work. ILO and UNHCR have a very old partnership. Some people might think that it started in 2016, and this is not actually correct. The MOU was renewed in 2016. The partnership started even in the 80s between the two organizations, and the two organizations work in a very complementary manner. we are both in terms of mandate. We have very specific mandate, very clear mandate. We both work on protection. ILO work on labor protection, UNHCR work on specific mandate of forced displacement and stateless and so on. So the complementarity is very high, and we are working together since the 80s. In 2016, the renewed MOU actually accelerated and increased the level of collaboration. Even before 2016, there were some work streams that have been boosted between the two organizations, and one of them is the aims. That is actually the topic of this webinar. One milestone in the collaboration was the guiding principles on the integration of refugees and other forced displacement persons in the labor market. It was a very important document issued by ILO that gives a very important international law type of foundation for refugees to be integrated in the labor market. The other document is the recommendation 205. That's a very important also milestone. It's a document also issued by ILO, and it gives refugees a very important space in the economic recovery. The other thing, we have a joint work plan between the UNHCR and ILO. It shows clearly how a humanitarian organization can work with a development organization in a complementary manner. The joint work plan is quite extensive. It contains a lot of work streams, including regional work, including global work, and country-level interventions. It's in many areas, and not only in the area of jobs and livelihoods. It even goes into child protection, social protection, and many different areas. One of the work streams in the joint work plan is around aims. And here is my last point. AIMS has started to be a joint initiative between ILO and UNHCR around 2012. It was really operationalized on the ground through case studies. A lot of value chain analysis has been done. And now in the webinar, you will see how the results were feeding into a global picture. What I would say to close my intervention is that AIMS is one of the ways to answer a very problematic question, which is how can we marry economic development and economic growth with inclusion? And how can we reduce the tension between these two notions? Because some might always portray that inclusion of additional workforce in the local economy will somehow reduce the economic growth and will reduce the economic ability of host countries, and especially if these additional people are refugees. And this is actually not correct. And the aims somehow challenge this aspect of tension between local economic development and inclusion of refugees in local economies. So I will stop here in terms of defining aims, because next panelists will talk about it in an extensive manner. But I wanted to finish my intervention by saying that we have seen that aims is one of the ways. It's not maybe the solution for everything when it comes to livelihoods and economic inclusion, but it's one of the ways because it can marry between economic development and inclusion, and it reduces tension, and it increases coexistence between host communities and refugees. Thank you again for attending the webinar, and over to Fernando.
Ziad, thank you so much. So yes, I intend to talk about the approach to inclusive market systems. Very briefly, I want to show and to explain a little bit what it is that we talk when we talk about the approach, and then we're gonna see how well it holds up when Robert and Nadia gives us their experience implementing it in the field. So Can you go to the next slide, Lisa, please? Yes, so AIMS, as Siad was saying, was developed by the ILO and UNHCR, and it's a market-based livelihood strategy that seems to apply the market systems approach to the context of forced displacement. The approach is based on this radical assumption that in order for jobs to be created in a sustainable manner, two things need to happen in a market. One, there have to be opportunities, and two, there has to be people with the skills and competencies to access those opportunities. It seems simple enough. Let's see. Can you go to the next one, please? Thanks. So markets, what we want to do is to apply and adapt the market system framework in forced displacement context. I know some of you attending are very knowledgeable of the market systems framework. Some of you are just hearing about this. So I want to be very brief just for all of us to be on the same page. When we talk about market systems framework, what we do is we try to understand a market in a systemic way. So we don't only want to focus on the different actors exchanging goods and services in a market or in a sector, but we want to look also at the supporting functions that these actors require in order to function the way they do, and the rules and regulations governing those actors exchanges these goods and services. So in the very middle of what we call the donut of market systems, or this little circle that you see in your screens, in the very middle, you see the demand and supply, the market, and the actors exchanging goods and services. On the top part of the donut, you see the supporting functions. So what are these? We're talking about information, training, mentoring, incubation, coaching, coordination, access to financial services, etc. So these are different actors and services that are available for the actors within the sector and the market that they need to function optimally. On the lower part of the donut, what we have is the rules and regulations that are governing these actors while they exchange these goods and services. So market system is telling us to look at labor laws, gender norms, skills and recognition standards, social norms, informal rules, whenever we are analyzing a particular market, because understanding this is going to inform better the possibility of refugees to participate in this particular market that we are going to analyze and develop. Can you go to the next slide, Elisa, please? So once we understand this market systemically and we understand the supporting functions and the rules and regulations that are governing this particular market or this particular sector that we might analyze, we want to develop what we call push and pull interventions. So as we said before, jobs are created where demand and supply meet, right? So what we want to do in AIMS is we want to work in both sides at the same time. So on the one side, we want to do what we call push, which is develop interventions that would help refugees and host communities access the opportunities through the development of their skills and competencies required to participate in that particular market. That could be through, for example, training solutions or access to information, access to financial services, better coordination through cooperativism, etc. But at the same time, what we want to do is we want to develop that value chain and that sector and that market to make it bigger and increase the opportunities of these refugees to participate within this market. We do that, for example, through developing and increasing market access and market opportunities for the actors within the chain to create those opportunities. So this is, in a nutshell and in a very reductionist way, what AIMS is. It's 4 minutes of it, but now I want to invite you all to buckle up because we're going to travel to Ethiopia and then we're going to travel to Lebanon to see how this that I'm telling is being applied and what challenges are we facing in today's, in 2020. So Robert, first of all, thank you so much for being with us. If you please can turn on your camera and unmute your mic, you can, take us to Ethiopia and the floor is all yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Fernando. I think I don't need to introduce myself because you've already done so at the beginning. I will give a presentation focusing on the Ethiopia operation and give some of our experiences with the COVID-19 situation, and also look at how it has impacted some specific projects, and what we envisage are some of the responses that we can put in place to mitigate the effects of this pandemic. If you go to the next slide, please. And my presentation will focus on 4 areas. We will look at the COVID-19 context. I think it's important for us to have a background on what is happening in Ethiopia. And then I'm going to also talk about the social economic impacts that we are seeing. And then we are going to look at how we are trying to respond to protect market supply chains. And then I'll finish with a few challenges. Next slide. Okay, so the government of Ethiopia, since March of 2020, came up with 4 key responses towards COVID-19. There was a state of emergency that was put in place in the country, which is a 5-month state of emergency. But this was not a full lockdown, it was a partial lockdown. And then the government in April of this year came up with a COVID-19 response strategy that was very multi-sectoral. So it looked at all sectors and how the sectors will be affected and what the government needs to do in terms of investments to mitigate the negative impacts these sectors are going to face over a 6-month period. And further, the government also came up with some economic reform measures. This was basically to protect the markets, the economy of the country, jobs, businesses, and so on and so forth. So these four responses, were very critical to ensure that the pandemic is managed somehow. And also, of course, there was the public health response, which I think is the priority investment for development actors, for humanitarian actors, and the government as well. Now, when you look at the figure on the right, what was projected over a 6-month period as job losses was 1.4 million jobs by the middle of the 6-month period. And we will go further to see what kind of impacts we have so far. And another critical area was in terms of losses in the agriculture sector, was estimated at almost $1 billion in losses over a 6-month period. Now, these projections are around 3 key areas that contribute to the GDP of the country: manufacturing and construction, the service industry, and agriculture. These ones contribute a lot to the GDP of the country, and they also employ a lot of people, both formally and informally. And that is why the Ethiopia's Job Creation Commission came up with this projection to see how interventions can move forward. If you move to the next slide, please. So when you look at some of the social economic impacts, we as UNHCR have been relying on data that is coming from some of our development partners. For example, the World Bank has been doing an analysis in iterations to see how the economy of the country has, and whether it's businesses or households have been affected by COVID-19. And they have come up with some really interesting information on that one. We also have Masiko, which, for example, has done a study in the Somali region, not on refugees, but focusing on host communities. We also have DFID, which is doing a study through Oxford Research Center to look at how COVID-19 has affected the urban population. And this particular study by DFID is also going to focus going to include refugees in the survey. With respect to data coming from the refugee hosting areas, what we call the frontier market, our data has not been to the level of quality that we see with our development partners. And this could be because we might not have the budgets to be able to undertake this kind of surveys, or we are also focusing so much on the life-saving humanitarian responses. Some of our data is also very anecdotal, but we try to triangulate all the information to make sure that we have a sense of what the impact is. And we have seen certain impacts. Like, for example, just recently, the government, the Ethiopia Job Creation Commission announced that 330,000 jobs were lost over a period of 4 months. Now, if you look at the previous slide, I said the midpoint projection was 1.4 million jobs, but only about a quarter of those jobs were actually lost. The projected jobs at risk were lost. But this was mainly because the country did not completely shut down. It was a partial lockdown that allowed the economy to continue functioning to a certain extent. And that's why a lot of jobs were also saved. We also see other areas that are very critical. For example, the demand for high value perishables. We are talking about, we have seen impacts on livestock sector, for example, the poultry sector, and even the areas, agriculture like vegetables and things like that. And this is because first of all, like when it comes to some of these perishables, the biggest absorbers of the perishables are actually the service industry. These are the hotels that are in Addis Ababa and other areas who absorb these commodities. But then we also see like for example, this year the Hajj has been cancelled. And Somalia in itself exports about $500 million worth of livestock to Saudi Arabia during the Hajj. There is also a lot of livestock trade between Ethiopia and Somalia, and all this livestock, the value chain ends up in the Middle East. So you can imagine if Somalia this year is not exporting any livestock, definitely the livestock sector on the Ethiopia side is equally going to suffer. So there's going to be a ripple effect. That is what we are seeing as some of the impacts we expect. And also there's reduced productivity in the manufacturing sector, in the retail sector. Businesses cannot meet their obligations. This is payment of loans, payment towards invoices, payment to salaries, and so on and so forth. We also see one of the other impacts that has been mentioned in some of these surveys is that an additional 10 million people have been pushed below the poverty line of 1.9 US dollars per day. This is a huge number. That's why they talk about national poverty rates rising by 9%. If you look at, for example, the PSNP, the urban safety net, both the urban and rural safety net programs, which are servicing about 8 million Ethiopian nationals, this is projected to now increase between 10 to 15 million people. And this is based on, some of this might change over a 6-month period. We don't know how the pandemic is going to pan out. So some of these impacts are the things that we are realizing within Ethiopia. And a critical one, which also affects refugees, is there's been a significant reduction in remittances. This of course affects a lot of Ethiopian nationals and refugees who receive money from their relatives abroad, mainly because in other countries also, there's job stress. People maybe have lost their jobs, people's incomes have reduced, and in tandem, they're not able to send what they used to send to their people back here. If you go to the next slide, please. Okay, so I want to zero in on a specific project just to try and show, what we are trying to do to protect some of these investments. I will focus on one project that we have in Ethiopia, which is located at the cusp of the border of Ethiopia, Kenya, and Somalia. This is a project this is the largest private sector funded project in a refugee setting anywhere in the world. It is financed by the IKEA Foundation, who have been our partners since 2012. And the investment is over $100 million. You can actually see, I've given some statistics on the ripple effect in terms of the investments that have been put into cooperatives, the number of refugee and host community farmers that we service, and this is just direct beneficiaries. We have put up 1,000 hectares of irrigation canals. We have a microfinance program as well, which is benefiting about 550 businesses. And we have 134 livestock traders, 234 meat sellers, and also 112 mixed sellers. These are all enterprises. And this project is located in one of the most remote areas of the country, which already is suffering from poor infrastructure. The area is very underserved in terms of basic services, even before COVID-19. So COVID-19 presents also another challenge towards this very complex setting. If you go to the next slide. Yes. So what are we also seeing with respect to this particular area? We also have not only COVID-19, but we have what we call competing crises. So one of the crises is the desert locust invasion. There was a lot of crop losses and animal fodder in the Somali region over the last couple of months. And there is also an expectation that there's going to be a second wave, which is migrating from northern Kenya into the Somali region in the south. That is a very big crisis. And we are working very closely with FAO to try and mitigate this issue. We also have the issue of floods, and this is now the rainy season that is coming. We have had floods which destroyed some crops in the irrigation farms. And we are expecting with this rainy season, there's going to be a lot of flow of the Genale River that goes all the way to Somalia, and there might be some flooding, which might affect our agriculture production. So these are the competing crises that we are trying to mention. And then what we have done also is that we have put up a livelihoods response plan, but based on a worst case scenario modeling, meaning that we have not yet seen the impact that will allow us to now put this ignite the worst case scenario. And this is because so far we have not seen any COVID-19 cases with refugees, and the cases are quite low in that particular region. But the danger is still there because there's a lot of cross-border trade between Kenya and Ethiopia and Somalia, despite the fact that the borders are closed only for cargo, but the border is very porous, so people move around.
Robert, and try to close up in a minute and a half, 2 minutes, please.
Yes, I will in 2 minutes.
Thanks.
And then I've given some figures. Like last year, these enterprises that I listed, generated almost $1.1 million in gross revenues. So we are not expecting to see those kind of incomes this year. And then we have the microfinance program, which lent out over $400,000. Refugees are not, we have seen and we have done an assessment. Most refugees are not putting in their money into the MFI anymore. They're preferring to put it at home because of social distancing. And we came up with this modeling based on the incomes these enterprises earn to support the worst case scenario. If the worst case scenario happens, then we will go for a economic stimulus package to support those enterprises so that they don't collapse. Can you go to the next slide? Yes, and then this is my last slide. I'll finish with this slide. Also, we also have to be very realistic when we are talking about, post-COVID-19. We don't know when this issue is going to end. That's number one. Number two, we have all these emergencies going on, and the priority is, of course, public health response. And investments are very limited, considering that there is, the public response is a priority. There is restricted movement and so on and so forth. The investments are focused on life-saving, the life-saving issues. So we are still trying to see how can we protect the markets as well to make sure that these supply chains do not collapse. But the priority focus is on public health. And we also want to be able to have really tangible data from the frontier areas, the refugee hosting areas, so that we can be able to also have an early warning response to make sure that we can plan properly moving forward. How is the economy in these areas being affected? Most of our data is very anecdotal. So we need to move to more concrete data that can help us make the right decisions. And then, of course, when we talk about this new abnormal, I think it's important for us to in terms of the uncertainty, to see we had a health issue. And I think right now, it is now moved to the economic problem, which is very critical, because now people are getting tired. People want to continue with their businesses, and so the markets have to open, even despite the fact that the numbers of infections are increasing exponentially across the region, not only in Ethiopia. And the fear is, with a pandemic, you go from the health, economic, and then you might end up having a social issue. If there's a complete lockdown, for example, you might end up with a social issue because people are not earning any livelihoods at all. So I would like to end here. That is just an example of what we are trying to do in Ethiopia, and I'll be willing to take questions afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert, so much. And yeah, to all of you, please, if you have any question, go to the little button down in your screens that says Q&A and type them in there. We're collecting them. And at the end, we're going to be able to answer some and hopefully most of them. So thanks, Robert. Now, yeah, I would like to introduce Nadia. Nadia is a technical officer in Lebanon. And yeah, thanks so much. And please, the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Fernando. Hello, everybody, and thanks for having me here today to tell you a little bit about our COVID-19 response here in Lebanon. As Fernando mentioned, I am a technical officer on AIMS. I'm coordinating a small component that is using the approach to inclusive market systems here in Lebanon. That's part of a bigger project program that's called Prospects. And before I start telling you about our COVID response, let me tell you just a little bit about the context here in Lebanon right now. Because actually, unfortunately, COVID-19 is not the only issue that Lebanon as a country is dealing with right now. Lebanon has actually been hit by a very severe financial crisis recently, and there's a severe dollar shortage. The Lebanese lira really has lost 80% of its value in the last couple of months, and that has resulted in prices of goods and services increasing massively, specifically for imported goods. So that was the situation when the COVID pandemic hit the country, and in a way it really amplified all these negative effects that were already there, both on businesses and on households. And unfortunately, because of the financial crisis, also the state right now is pretty much bankrupt. They're doing obviously what they can, but there isn't any money to really help businesses or households on a large scale. And so that has meant that really a lot of businesses have gone bankrupt. We don't have concrete data right now yet, but it doesn't look good really. And obviously a lot of people have been laid off also. We did a very quick assessment here, and we saw that about 39% of Lebanese people have actually been permanently laid off. And shockingly, that number is even higher for Syrian refugees. We were talking about 60% that have been permanently laid off. And so scarily, even the people that have kept their jobs have seen their purchasing power massively reduced due to the devaluation. And so all of that has really pushed both Lebanese host communities and Syrian refugees and other refugees as well further into poverty. Now, the obvious question is, how did we respond to that? So our project here, my small project component, seeks to create decent jobs for both host communities and refugees in the agricultural sector. Traditionally, both groups have found employment in the agricultural sector, sometimes in different positions. So it's mostly the Lebanese that own the farms, and many of the workers on the farms are actually Syrians. So our strategy is by helping the sector, by developing the sector and helping small enterprises and farms in the sector, that we want to benefit really both groups. And so from the start, we've been applying a push-pull approach, and thanks to Fernando, who already explained what that is. So we're looking both at push to strengthen capacities of SMEs, but also at the pull, so at markets, at sectors with potential to create more opportunities. And so obviously we've asked ourselves, well, how can we adapt this whole approach now to respond better to COVID-19, but also all the other crises that have been happening here? And what we're doing right now is on the push side, we're really giving immediate and direct support for enterprises that need that right now. So there's training, there's coaching, there's grants to help small enterprises in the agricultural sector. That part of the project is actually handled by my colleague Ryan. I don't know if he's listening in right now, but he's currently rolling out a training on business continuity to really help small enterprises weather that crisis. But we also said, well, that's actually not enough. We also need to look at the overall market system at sectors as a whole to see how can we help the system as a whole overcome these shocks. Because obviously, when we look at enterprises in the agricultural sector or any sector really, on the one hand, they do need skills, they do need capacities, but they also need access to inputs, access to markets, functioning supply chains, and all kinds of services really to function properly. And so with this component that I'm coordinating, we're specifically looking really at the overall market system and seeing what can we do right now to develop these market systems and to help these systems overcome that shock that has been induced by these multiple crises. One thing that we've seen is that it's really, really important to understand exactly what is happening on the market and how these crises have affected the systems and the functioning of supply chains and sectors. And so for our project specifically, we had done a full market systems analysis in the horticulture sector that we had completed in January this year. And you're seeing the results here in a nutshell in front of you. So this is the market system. And in yellow, marked in yellow, you see the issues, the constraints that we had identified at the time. And so, as mentioned, we completed that market systems analysis in January this year, and then the crisis hit, several crises hit. And so obviously, the first thing that we did is ask ourselves, well, how has that now changed results of the analysis? And is our analysis still valid, or do we need to start from scratch and do something else? Well, what we saw very quickly is that actually the type of constraints that we had identified that enterprises in the sector are struggling with, they did not change due to the crisis. Enterprises, farmers, refugees in the sector are still facing the same constraints, the same challenges. However, due to the crisis, all of these constraints have just gotten so much worse. So in a way, the COVID-19 crisis and other crises have really just amplified problems massively, the problems that were already there before. Let me give you one example specifically. Here in Lebanon right now, we know that farmers have huge problems accessing inputs right now, agricultural inputs. That is because of the devaluation of the Lebanese pound. Inputs have just massively increased in price, and farmers can't afford them anymore. And so they're really struggling right now to keep agricultural production going and cultivate their fields because they can't afford these inputs. And so we thought about, well, what can we do? And obviously the first thing that we thought about is, well, we could go out and we could distribute those inputs to farmers, right? And that is actually something that many organizations here have done, and luckily so, because obviously in agriculture, that's all very time sensitive. So farmers needed those inputs right now. But in parallel, we also asked ourselves, well, what is our long-term vision here? Because we can't keep distributing those inputs, right? So what can we do to help the market system really overcome that shock? And here we tried to dig a little deeper, and we found that actually, yes, well, the cost of inputs increased massively, and that is obviously a huge problem. The bigger problem is actually linked to financing mechanisms. Because farmers used to rely on an informal credit system whereby there were input suppliers and sometimes also wholesalers and off-takers that would kind of pre-finance these inputs. So farmers would receive those inputs and then pay for them after the harvest. Only that with the crisis, that system has broke down. And suppliers are no longer inclined to extend credit, but they're asking the farmers to pay on the spot for the inputs, which farmers cannot do. So why did that system break down? Part of the reason is that currently banks have frozen credit lines, making it hard for companies to themselves get credit and pass it on to farmers. But a big part of the reason is also related to risk, really. Because with so many farmers struggling, input suppliers and wholesalers are now finding it so much more risky to lend to farmers, and they're reluctant to extend credit to farmers because they feel that some of them, or many of them, might actually not be able to pay for these inputs after the harvest. And so in a way that also relates a little bit to a constraint that we found during the analysis is related to trust. Really, trust was already weak. And again, that has been amplified hugely by this crisis. And this finance mechanism have broken down. So we asked ourselves, well, what can we do to reestablish this system long term? And obviously that's not easy, but we're right now looking into options to work with input suppliers and wholesalers and to kind of de-risk these investments for them, to get them once more to lend to farmers. One of the things that we're likely gonna be doing is setting up some form of credit guarantee scheme that would de-risk these investments for them by guaranteeing kind of a part of the losses that they might be making if farmers fail to pay for these inputs. And so all of that really to help these input suppliers and the wholesalers to once again lend to farmers and re-establish that informal credit system that would make it possible for farmers to once again obtain the inputs and pay for them later on. So I'm not pretending to have a miracle solution here for all these things, and obviously it's not going to be easy, but my main point here is, so next to the immediate and direct response to help enterprises weather the crisis right now, that of course is so valuable, we also need to think a little bit long term and ask ourselves, well, what can we do to reestablish the market system as a whole? And here, so one of the lessons learned for me is that it's really important to identify the root causes of the issues. So it's mentioned for us, it seemed at first glance that the main issue is the price increase of the input. But actually when we digged a bit deeper and looked at the root causes, we did find that the underlying issue here is the breakdown of that informal credit system. And so it's important to understand these changes in the market system and the root causes in order to tackle these issues really sustainably and help market systems recover from the shock and in the long term also become more resilient for the benefit of all the actors working in this market system. And so I'm going to stop here, but obviously I'll stand ready for any question, to answer any questions later on. Thank you.
Oh, Nadia, thank you so much. Yeah, very interesting. And yeah, the struggle is real. And yeah, very, very interesting stuff and very cool approaches to the context. We have invited two active listeners, Richmond Woya, who's a Livelihood and Economic Inclusion Officer from UNHCR in Malawi, and Stephen Opio, who's the CTA and Country Office Coordinator on the ILO Uganda. I will ask Richmond and Stephen, Richmond first and then Stephen, to share one insight of this conversation that you're taking with you for tomorrow and then on, to please share with all of us, and then we're gonna go to the Q&A. Richmond, are you with us?
Yes, Fernando.
Yes.
I'm with you. Can you hear me?
I can hear you loud and clear, Richmond.
Great. So I think from all the presentations that have been presented so far, the key takeaways that I've taken are based on number one, I've looked at the need for the pull and push interventions when designing these market-based interventions. But at the same time, there's this COVID pandemic that has come on board. It becomes challenging, especially during times of lockdowns, to have that preparedness response because key issues have been raised by Robert in terms of responses that have been done in Ethiopia. But at the same time, my colleague, the previous presenter from ILO, also has highlighted a lot Nadia, because Nadia, I think we were together in Malawi at some point, so we did some rapid market assessment. So yeah, interesting, presentation from her, where she has also talked about the issues, the challenges that participants are facing, especially in terms of input supply, as well as the financial, services due to the recession that is taking place. So what I'm also trying to get here is that we can equally ask key questions to say, how then do we facilitate access to financial services when the economy is also in a recession? But at the same time, we are also having this COVID pandemic. That's something that we can also deeply, think about and brainstorm. But also another key area takeaway that I've also looked at is, yes, assuming there's a lockdown, because for Robert, he says there was a partial lockdown. So it means business, the economy was still moving, but in other countries, there was a complete lockdown. So in that instance, how do we look at innovation, including digital technology, looking at the COVID, pandemic lessons that we're experiencing right now, and at the same time, to ensure that it says, services are accessible to the participants down there, like the refugees and host communities, but at the same time, after the COVID pandemic, they recover from the shocks that are there. So, because I have only 3 minutes to talk about, I think I should wind up to say that we have to think deep on push interventions to say, okay, now it's a lockdown. What type of push interventions do we bring on board in terms of skills and competencies? Do we have to bring in the coaching services? What about the network engagements? Do we have to be right in the field? If we don't have to be in the field, how can we provide such services to ensure that the skills and competencies are strengthened by those that participate in our interventions? But in terms of poor interventions, we also have to think deep to say, okay, now there's a lockdown. How do we engage the markets? Opportunities that are there on the ground, because during lockdowns, there might be other opportunities coming out where our participants can participate in. Like, for example, quick supply of goods and services, even food items. Some of our participants can be engaged in provision of food supplies to ensure that they also benefit from income generating activities. But if there are tougher rules, what happens? So I think the pandemic has made us to rethink the way we should implement, our livelihood interventions. Because Robert indicated that investments are limited in an environment where you have restrictions. So for camp setups, what do? Do we bring in the private sector based on the opportunities we see from the poor interventions, or do we follow the private sector? If we don't, how do we do it? Yeah, so maybe in summary, that's what I can talk about. But I've seen a lot of questions are popping up in the board. So we also have restricted time. Maybe Stefan, hope you can take over from the thinking that I've just shared.
Thank you, Richmond. Thank you so much. And Stephen, what insight do you take out of what we have presented and the questions and the insight that Richmond have shared that you can take for your work here on?
Thank you, Fernando and colleagues for the submissions. I think a couple of things there, and also, first of all, appreciating the language used by Nadia in her presentations, quite appropriate in terms of de-risking and being an active player in the market or not. But most importantly, it's good to also appreciate the opening remarks which were provided earlier. About 60% or so of refugees who do not have access to work, and we are talking about a legislative issue here, because we could talk about facilitating market access and the ability to access opportunities, but what is the legislative environment? Does it allow for these refugees and host communities to access work? If there are opportunities, can the refugees actually participate? That is a very key thing which I thought was not mentioned in any of the cases of Ethiopia or Lebanon. So it would be good to listen to that. But a few takeaways for myself from this. The issue of being an active player versus playing the facilitative role, which Naja does point out too. If the key issue now is the challenge of access to inputs for the farmers, refugee farmers, do we get in there and purchase the inputs because they're time bound, or do we identify market actors who we can strengthen their ability to provide this role? That also did not come out very clearly for me in the case of Ethiopia. It would be good to understand and appreciate what role UNHCR plays within strengthening the market systems, whether they play an active role or they do facilitate. The numbers given from the ICAIC project are quite impressive, but it would be good to understand much more what role that UNHCR plays directly in this. I'll give an example in the case of Uganda, where Office of the Prime Minister is working on an issues paper, and they're pointing out that up to 86% of refugees in the case of Uganda are earning through their engagement in the agricultural sector. Now, with the COVID situation, it means the limitation in terms of access to inputs and the lockdown of some of these districts, which are border districts, means this 86% cannot participate actively in the agricultural sector. But even if they could, how do they access some of these inputs? So I thought this highlight by Naja was a key area for me. Then two, the whole issue of resilience of the refugees and host communities. First of all, even before COVID, most of these refugee settlements and camps are in areas that are not economically strong, and the poverty indicators are quite high. So the ability of the refugees and host communities to handle the shocks that come with COVID is one that needs to be strengthened through their participation in these value chains. In the case of Uganda, one of the things that we are trying out now is making available resources through cooperatives and farmers associations for them to provide some resuscitation opportunities to their members who have been heavily affected during this COVID situation. We have just put out a call for proposals. We don't know what the outcome would look like, but it's one of the things that we thought, instead of being an active player, can we identify the cooperatives and farmers groups and member-based organizations who appreciate and understand the market and the value chains better, and provide some opportunity to advance resources, either through what you'd call a stimulus package or a grant or de-risking opportunities, which allow for some of these groups to access resources, to resuscitate their enterprises and improve functioning of the market there. Another thing that I picked from here in Naja's presentation as well is the issue of how did you put it? The issue of supply chains. What role can we play to ensure that the supply chains in these market systems and value chains are actually not cut completely? If we are to strengthen the local economic development potentials of these refugee hosting areas, then we need to identify the opportunities where these refugees and host communities can play an active role in those value chains, and therefore not limiting the opportunities in the supply chains. So for me, again, just in summary, one is the legislative issue. It's good to look at that as well, because that is the starting point. In the case of Uganda, we are fortunate that the Refugee Act does allow for refugees to participate in the labor market. would want to capitalize on this. In the other countries, it would be good to listen to what can be done, because irrespective of the opportunities, if the legislative environment is not conducive, and then not much will be done in terms of improving the refugee livelihoods and strengthening inclusion of refugees in the labor markets, and eventually the local economy of these regions being strengthened. So in brief, those are the few takeaways and inputs that I thought I should give. Over to you, Fernando. I'll respond to any questions if there's any.
Thanks, Stephen. So we are very short on time and we have many questions. Thank you all of you for your questions. The question that we won't be able to answer here live, we will ask our panelists to answer them, and we will share them with the recording of the webinar just for all of you to have an answer to your questions. But I would like to focus on two questions that I think are broad enough and that could help us understand the overall theme of the webinar. One from Nicholas Gregswood. Nick, hello. So to what extent can services in sectors like agriculture be provided through digital technology? I imagine that's popping up quite often. And the other one that I have here is, sorry, I think, yes, here. In both contexts, sorry, I lost it now. Is the question about, yeah, here. Considering the magnitude of the crisis and conditional cash interventions at household and SME level have been deployed mostly everywhere. So, however, how those interventions may not be sustainable in the long run, what ILO and UNHCR are experiencing in this context, from Stefano Nani. So, Nadia and Robert, feel free to provide us with a short comment on this, please, and or see it if you want.
Happy to start quickly if you want.
Yes, thanks.
Maybe Robert can chip in. So the first question, yeah, to what extent can these services be provided digitally? I think some of them can, no? And we've seen trainings move online. We've seen advice and different types of BDS services move online. Luckily, I mean, speaking here for Lebanon, Lebanese people tend to be quite entrepreneurial, and I've seen, so whenever that is possible, they adapted actually quite quickly also. So we've seen business development services move online and these kind of things. Obviously, that is more difficult when we talk about actual physical goods, no? So in the case of Lebanon, what I outlined here, the inputs, we're talking about like pesticides, fertilizers, etc. These can't be delivered digitally, obviously. So yeah, but it's still possible to physically deliver these things because the agricultural sector here in Lebanon has been exempted a little bit from the lockdown restrictions. So that wasn't the underlying issue, but rather the fact that the financial systems broke down and the farmers can't pay for these anymore. But maybe these are my 2 cents.
Yes.
Do you want Robert chip into that question, or shall I go to the second question right away?
Yeah, maybe I can chip into that question. Yes, of course, digital services can be used. I will give an example based on the IKEA project that we have. First of all, when you look at something like financial services, most of the refugees or the host communities in those regions actually use mobile money applications from across the border. So they'll use mobile money applications from Kenya, they'll use mobile money applications from Somalia region. That is already digital in some sense. And secondly, we have also, we are also partnering with the UNCDF to specifically focus on digital literacy and the ability for refugees to be able to use digital services. This is something that was supposed to start before COVID, but right now they have issued the RFA, where they are going to engage either an NGO or they're going to engage a technology company that is going to go to the Somali region to make sure that they can provide trainings, and they're also going to provide some assistance in terms of hardware to make sure that digital services can start being integrated. That is the way I'd like to answer this question. Over.
Yes, thanks, Robert. So the second question, Nadia, do you need me to read it again?
Yes, please.
Yes. So yeah, considering the
Please,
magnitude of the crisis, so basically unconditional cash interventions at household and SME level have been deployed mostly everywhere. So however, those interventions might not be sustainable in the long run. So what can ILO and UNHCR are experiencing in these contexts?
Yeah, it relates to a little bit to what I've been presenting also. No, I do think that both are necessary right now. Obviously, yes, unconditional grants and financial support is not sustainable, but it's still also very much needed as an immediate response to the crisis. No, I mean, if enterprises, if people can't work, they need cash to stay in that period of time, and there's no way around. I think giving them these kind of unconditional support in some form or another. But so I think that in parallel, we also already need to think about what can we do to make things more sustainable. And as mentioned in my presentation, I personally think that that depends very much on the context and on the challenges and constraints that you find. So I think it's very important to analyze kind of how was the market affected by these things? Is there an issue with getting supplies? Is there an issue with financial systems that broke down? Is there higher risk? And that's what made actors change their business model, and we maybe need to work with them to bring them back to what they were before. I really think there's no one size fits all approach here, but depending on the context, solutions need to be found together with different local actors to see what we can do to reestablish these systems. Fortunately, you know, like miracle solution here, just a couple of thoughts.
Yes, thanks. Robert, do you want to?
Yes, I can add on that. Let me just say, first of all, there is no textbook manual to COVID-19. Nobody ever anticipated this. You cannot use a textbook approach to COVID-19. And the response has been a knee-jerk response by very many agencies and organizations. Now, because people are losing incomes, of course, you know, cash makes sense. For example, UNHCR at country level in Ethiopia is doing about 4%, but we have a threshold that we should move to 12% of cash application. And this cash has been very important to make sure that people still have the purchasing power to be able to meet their basic needs during this COVID-19 pandemic. Now, we will have to rethink at some point what is the best mechanism moving forward. And let me say, considering that some of these enterprises and businesses were not receiving cash before because they were given, you know, the capital to start these businesses, and they've been running these enterprises and they were not receiving cash. But right now we are doing it as a cushion to make sure that they can survive this next 6 to 12 months. So we'll have to rethink it at some point. After we have more information, more data on what works and what doesn't work. Thank you.
Thank you. I would like to have just one more question, considering that we have some attendees left. Nadia and Robert, if you are okay with it, just the last one. So I guess this is from Robert Cabenguera. And I would like to add on that. So how people can strengthen local markets while local economy is down. So it looks quite a juxtaposition, right? How, I guess, to add on that, what is the mindset when we are developing these projects, understanding that the economy is down? How is the mindset for us when we are approaching value chains that we want to strengthen within this context? Nadia or Robert?
Well, that's a tough one. I think strengthening local markets while the local economy is down. So I assume that means lockdown, no? I mean, we've had that in Lebanon where we were completely under lockdown. We were not allowed to go out. Everything was just shut down. So in that situation, I don't think there's too much we can do. No, we can move things digital, as Nick suggested. Kind of some of the things can be done digital, advice, trainings, discussions, etc. But then I guess during the lockdown, we just kind of had to wait it out, but then the question is, how do we help kickstart that economy again once it is possible again to move and to get businesses started? And yeah, again, here, as Robert so nicely said, there is really no manual. No, it all depends on the local context and in what we can do. But once again, personally, I'm convinced that the response needs to be a combination of immediate responses through grants, trainings, and coaching mechanisms to help SMEs weather the crisis right now, but also looking at the long run and seeing how can we establish these market systems again and help the overall system to overcome that shock sustainably.
Awesome. Robert, I see you unmute your mic.
Yes, maybe just to add to what Naja said, because I agree with her answer. But I'll give you an example, because I said that in Ethiopia we had a partial lockdown. So the markets were able to function to some extent. I think the biggest market that was hit is the services sector, which are hotels, because most of them shut down. But when you look at the first slide that I presented, the government had 4 responses, and one of the responses was based on economic reforms, whereby the government came up with certain recommendations, like making it easier for people to access loans and credits from the bank, even without collateral. That was one of the fiscal reforms that were put in the country. They talked about businesses should not lay off people, allowing businesses to be able to get their tax refunds in a very quick manner. Those are some of the responses, just to try and balance and to make sure that businesses don't close down. If you look at the World Bank, survey that was done in May, about 41% of businesses had completely shut down. But when they did the same survey in June, it fell from 41% to 29%. So that shows that the economy is recovering because of some of the policy issues that are being put in place by the government. It was just an example I wanted to give. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you, Nadia. Thank you, Ziad. Thank you, Richmond. And thank you, Stephen. And thank you to all of you that attended today. It's for us a pleasure to have you today here. Yeah, I think just to close up, thank you all. A key message is there is no magic solution, but looking at the problem from a systemic perspective and understanding that we have to develop solutions in multiple avenues at the same time. I think that's a key takeaway that I myself will take with me for tomorrow and Monday on. Yeah, once again, thank you all of you for joining us and for staying later. And thank you again once for our panelists to being here with us and sharing your experience. Hope to see you all very soon. Be safe, and yeah, see you around.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Fernando.
Thank you, Nadia.
Thank you very
nice to see
Thank
you.
you very much, Fernando. It was very interesting.
Thank you.
Bye.